Hello, and welcome back to our summer series of Technically Speaking. The whole series is focusing on decisions you can make and levers you can pull to make sure the performance of your applications is as fast as possible while balancing the needs of your project. Over the next 8 weeks, we'll be looking at topics from RBAC to caching to modularity and screen rendering. In this episode, we have John Hobaika joining us to discuss workflows in Unqork and what decisions are the keystones to designing your performant workflow. John, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hey, thanks. My name is John Hobaika, principal solutions architect here at Unqork. I've been here for almost 3 years. I've got to work on a lot of really fun projects here. A lot of really nifty things we've worked on together. Helped build out some really cool functionality. Worked with our platform team a lot to get like some things like the dynamic refresh going. Really excited to sit here and kind of help everyone out understand workflows a little bit better.
So I know we're talking about workflows, but maybe let's step back and talk about in Unqork, what is a workflow? What does that look like? Because I know in business it has one meaning, but in Unqork we sometimes talk about something else.
Sure. So when we're talking about like workflows in Unqork, right? That's just the way we're actually going out and building out the applications themselves. We're using our workflow features. So let me go ahead and share my screen, and we'll do kind of like a little quick run through of everything. All right. So this is just like a little basic workflow I had set up. So let's just go ahead and take a look at what it looks like to work in a workflow. So this is like what our workflows really look like. And I think the easiest way I would think about a workflow is it's a canvas that lets you kind of do a whole lot of things that you normally do in Unqork in a faster and more efficient manner. Typically in Unqork, you build by modules. And then if you want to add, any kind of styling or navigation or validations or, any kind of data persistence. There's all these kind of things that you typically would do in Unqork that you have to do at a module by module level. And it makes this a little bit more challenging and a little bit more, the barrier to entry makes this where, you want to know things a little bit better to move faster in Unqork when you build with modules. Now, the nice thing about workflows is it really kind of makes that barrier to entry significantly easier for you, and you can build what you want a lot faster. So like, for example, typically in Unqork, when you build modules, you have to build components to then connect other modules to other modules. You no longer have to do that, right? Workflows here make this life easy for you. So, we can kind of talk a little bit more about that, Dara, or, if we want to kind of jump in, or if there's any other questions you want to know about workflows in general.
So it sounds like the benefit to the workflow is all the connections between the modules that you build, whether it's decision pathways or moving from one to the next or handoffs, are built into the workflow tool.
Yeah, I'd say so. And, also it really just allows you to add features in there that you typically have to add manually, and you can do it at like module by module. And now you can kind of do this at an entire app level.
Great.
Yeah.
So are there other pros to using workflow, especially when we're talking about performance?
Yeah. So I think one of like the really nice things about workflow is data management. Workflows give you the ability to kind of store all your submissions directly under your workflow. Again, typically in Unqork, people store their data against specific modules. So that means you have to be very cognizant of where data is being stored. Workflows kind of give you a all-in-one location to store all the data you want. Now, we'll talk about that a little bit later. It doesn't mean that that's something to be kind of just taken for granted. You do need to be cognizant of some features of workflows to ensure performance is optimized for what the kind of app you're building. But workflow really does give you a way to kind of jump in and start building an application significantly faster with a little bit less, knowledge of Unqork than you need without using a workflow.
Great. And one of the things I know we spoke about in addition to data persistence is the state of your application is stored. So you kind of have that always there and can know where is this person in that flow.
Yes.
What are some good cases for workflow then?
Okay. So I think, love using, I think like a common use case we like to do here is like a rate quote bind with insurance. Any kind of aspect really where you have something where you may have multiple roles, you want to have different swim lanes, you want to be able to add some functionality that allows like gives the user like a general kind of app look and feel, right? You have the ability to kind of just go ahead and build out an application. There's a whole bunch of different pages. I think like, generally like quite like, answering questions, uh, you know, going through, registration or filling out, as we said, like you can do like, filling out an application, whether it's, for insurance or even if it's, something like, there's a whole bunch of different kind of things you can do here. But really, like a workflow is something that can be really used in every instance you need. And again, I think the nice piece about a workflow is uh, all the functionality that you typically want to include in building an application can be done from one centralized location. So, I can't think of too many instances where you wouldn't want to use a workflow, but the main thing that you want to be focusing on using a workflow is the size of your application, how many people you expect to be using the application, how much data you expect to be flowing in and out of the application. So those are kind of the factors that you want to be thinking about as you do this.
And now I know we're looking at kind of a blank screen in front of
Yeah,
us with
let's not
lots
make
of
it blank.
choices. So we do have a lot of levers that we can pull, right? Whether it's how many tasks we pull in or messages, different signals to send off. With that, can you show us some of the choices that we should make in order to make this workflow performant?
Sure. So, I think again, when you look through a workflow, there's so many settings and so many things you can do. So like if we're going to start off, you're going to use this task node to kind of probably get you kicked off. Uh, if you look through within them, you have all these kind of options here. So one thing that's really cool about this also is you have this ability for a static or dynamic screen type. So when we see these task nodes, this is like where you would put your module. So if you wanted to use this and create a mod and like put a module in here, you'd be able to go and select from your existing modules. Or if you'd like to create a brand new module, you could do so from within. Like this can get started from within here. Um, I think this is like a good place to start. Now, the other aspect to this as well that we should look through is if you want to do something dynamic, this is like a really cool feature as well, where if based off of certain things, you can dynamically change the module that you have here. So if I have like for example, for like these three tasks and I want to connect them together, I should probably have stated, the visual experience of workflow is pretty cool. So, if you want to be connecting these together, you have the ability to kind of predetermine what these modules are, or you can dynamically set modules in here if you so choose. Now, back to like this whole performance thing. What is going to happen is as we go from page to page, uh, the data gets stored from each page. Now, something to be very mindful of is the data that I will store on this module will also be stored in the same submission that the data from this module is going to be stored in, and then this module. So what I'm saying here is typically normal Unqork building where you're not using a workflow, people may want to store data from this module specifically here specifically here, and here specifically here. That can make it a little bit complicated to get all the data you want, but it also gives you some performance benefits of not having too much data in one location. The workflow gives you the ability to kind of store all of this in one location, but to be mindful is now you're combining all of this. And we've seen some workflows where you have many task nodes. So now the amount of data that you have can get quite large. So one of the things I would highly recommend when you are going through looking through a workflow is ensuring that you have your data, like you have kind of your settings matched to what you're really expecting for. So on this task node specifically here, you'll see that you have these abilities to have save data on navigation, which essentially means that I'm now going to be storing the data when I move from here to here. If that's not something I want, right? If I want to be a little bit more safe and, maybe I have, 50 data points here and I don't really want to save all of them. I mainly only care about 5 or 10. This is something that you would want to go ahead and check off. Now, the cool thing here, right, is this is a module by module level feature. So I can go ahead and say, I want to save all the data here, keep this on. I don't want to save all the data here, don't keep this on. Now, what you can also do is when you create the modules themselves, you have the ability to persist the individual components from your modules to our database. So what you would do is if you're like, oh, I want to be saving, I have like 5 out of 100 fields here that I do want to save, but I don't want to save it on this. Like I want to disable this, but I'm going to make sure those are saved. You still have the ability at the component level to go ahead and make those and persist those to the database and still save them as you wish. So I think another big feature as far as data persistence goes is if you look at the workflow settings themselves, we could talk through a few of these, but as far as performance goes, I think one thing that's like really important to pay attention to are some of these right here. So this ability here to only keep persisted data upon navigation. This is kind of what this is part of what I'm talking about. So I can turn this on at the whole workflow level, and then I can make sure that only the data that I persisted on my specific modules gets stored instead of everything. Sorry, any questions there? Or?
No, I was going to say that's huge. That was your first thing, was you have to know how much data your submission is going to have because it's being stored in one place.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm talking with my architect brain, but this is like by far the most important thing that I would tell everyone to work through with the workflow, so you can really like enjoy all the benefits of a workflow without really kind of worrying about affecting your performance, because there are a lot of cool features that you can like utilize here. And again, I think you've been hearing me talk about the doing things at a module by module level. Using a workflow kind of gives you the ability to do one thing centralized in one location and affect all the modules. So you're not doing it one by one by one. So I think that's something pretty cool. But again, I think something that we have to be very mindful of here is what these levers are, when to turn them on, when you want them to be turned on. So yeah.
Absolutely. And the one above it, the toggle, pass non-persistent express data to automated task gateway and conditional events. That one also feels like that could be very helpful, but also potentially cause some issues.
Right. So I think this one is pretty good because, so maybe let's talk about what this looks like in general, right? So if I have like these gateways, and this is going to be one of my favorite ones right here. When you're sending some of this data in here, okay. Well, actually, you know what? I changed my mind. We'll talk about this one later. Let's do, what's a good one? What's one that I want to use here? All right. Well, here, let's talk about this, because this will jump into like one of the cool features that I like. When you're sending data through some of these nodes, so this is our messaging node, right? This one is awesome because typically to set up, your messaging service, you're going to have to, go to the services administration, and you have to, kind of independently set that up. Here, the workflow offers you ability to kind of set up messaging within a workflow itself and have it trigger throughout your processes. So if I had an event where I'm from here and now I want to go send an email based off some condition, I can now have it send from here to my messaging. So that point you were talking about before about passing non-persistent data, this will give you the ability to kind of send some data here that if you want it to not be stored in your database, so like if I want data to not be stored within my workflow submission, I now have the flexibility to say I could still send this, I could still put the data I want here without having it need to be stored in my workflow submission. This is something that, in use cases we've seen before where sometimes clients don't want, or people may not want all their data persisted, but the workflow used to require that, the data that I want to be using to pass into some of these gateways and nodes has to be persisted against my workflow submission. Now we have that flexibility to no longer need to do that. So I don't have to. So like this is another kind of powerful feature where if I want to make sure that, I'm persisting certain pieces of data, I'm not persisting other pieces of data, but I still want some of those non-persistent pieces of data to be used within my workflow itself. This, like that setting you talked about, gives you the ability to do that. So I think those are like, as far as some performance toggles, I think those are pretty good ones to understand. I do think another thing to talk through as well, though, is something that I know our team has worked on to improve over the course of like the workflow history is the revision histories of your workflows. So what Unqork will do by default is when I move my data from here, so when I navigate from here to here, if I have especially some of that setting where I'm storing data on my navigation, every time I navigate, or if I navigate back, it's also going to update the same data that I was at here. So for example, if I was here and then I navigated here and then I navigated here, this is the first time where I write the data to my submission. I come here, now I'm writing this data to my submission. I'm also now going to go back and update the data here, even if it wasn't necessarily always updated. This is something that is powerful. People do want this feature available to them, but this is also something that you should be aware of, because if you especially have like large amounts of nodes, you have lots of data going on, making sure that you disable the revision history of a workflow is pretty important. And then there are also some feature flags available that can kind of give you the ability to enable your revision history but not affect performance. So those are some things that you can look into. But again, these are kind of like things that I would be pretty mindful of. One more thing to be mindful of when you are storing your data. Again, I think the really powerful feature of a workflow is you're storing the data in your workflow. But because you are now putting modules into a workflow, a lot of times people will maybe be reusing different like maybe someone will reuse a module that is built in a different in a different application with the same environment, and they're like, well, why create a new one? I can just use that same module here. Powerful, right? It's really good. But now what you want to be careful about is where you're storing the data, because in your one module, you still might have the data being stored in that module itself. And then now if you're going to put this module in the workflow, you are now duplicating that data over two spaces. So these kind of things, again, I think are very important to kind of be aware of. And as long as you are, it really kind of lets you leverage like some really cool powers of the workflows.
Amazing. Are there any other levers we should talk about that people should be aware of that affect most workflows?
So yeah, I mean, I think there's a few more. So like these nodes that you have here are pretty powerful, right? So I do think the messaging node is pretty cool. Something that I also kind of find that thing is pretty cool here is you have this ability, especially if you are kind of sending an email to someone and you want to give them a link to enter Unqork. Authentication can be a little bit of an issue, right? Especially if it's something where I want to give someone one-time access, or they may not have an account. I need to set something up as an anonymous user. There are instances where kind of setting those things up may take a little bit of understanding and knowledge. Typically what we like to do is create something called a refer string, which is just basically a link that can be set to one-time use that you can go ahead and click, get into the system, do what you got to do, and then that link is expired. And so that's something that you actually have the ability to do here, which I think is like super cool and very helpful. So I think that's like a really cool lever to know. Some other really cool, interesting levers that we talked about, we mentioned briefly, like the swim lanes. So you can have automated swim lanes. So you can have like, let's say you can have like parallel processes be going on. You can use this node. So I can have, this while on my front end, the user is, doing XYZ. I can also have in my automated lane a process running in the background while they're doing that. So that's a very powerful lever that you can utilize here. I think another really powerful lever that we a lot of us really love to use here are the timer start nodes. So the timer start node is like a really great way to kind of set up doing something as a batch job. If you want to have something where you need to fire off a process 3 times a day, or like, midnight or whatever, you now have the ability to kind of use this node that can then go ahead and trigger the workflow at whatever time you like. So you have these settings here. You can also set cron jobs, which is like a newer feature, which is this is something that's been super helpful. I think another powerful feature that's relatively new is the timer start node itself. Whereas this is something that would say, hey, this is going to run at 8 p.m. This timer start node can be something like, hey, I'm now actually going to fire something off right now, but right now I want that timer to start. So if this is something like I want this to run, and I want to run at 8 p.m., I can have this set for 8 p.m. If now I want to have the other option to say, well, I want something to run in 5 hours, but I only want it to run in 5 hours once I say run in 5 hours. Now you can use this timer start node. And this is something that I think is super helpful that we've actually been utilizing some of our newer apps as well. So I think those are some pretty good ones. And then maybe if we look through the settings one more time, I think there were some other ones I wanted to kind of briefly touch through. So the state control is pretty cool. So this just allows for how you're kind of navigating in and out of your app. It's actually another very powerful feature of Unqork, your state control, of the workflows themselves. The ability to kind of just go back into your application and the workflow will automatically know where you need to go and kind of render load the data that you need. Without a workflow, that's something you have to build into your configuration. So that's something that's super helpful. I think you have some custom messaging at the workflow level you can add in. You also can kind of something that's, I think it's a little inherent, but if you're building an app in a module, you have to use a navigation component to let you to move, right? To know I'm on step A, B, C, go from one page to another. That is something built into Unqork, and you had the ability for, if you want it to be vertical or horizontal, how you jump back and forth within the navigation. These are all things that you have the ability to kind of handle within Unqork itself. And then, you also have this ability to validate, when you're navigating back and forth, you can make sure you're validating anything on your page. So if something happened where, you had a required field and it wasn't entered, you can make sure that kind of validation is happening on the workflow level itself instead of just module by module. So those are kind of some of the cool, nifty, fun little fields, fun little things that you can do with workflows. So yeah.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us today, John. And thank you everyone else for joining us and hearing about workflow. We will be back in 2 weeks to meet with Noor, one of our senior architects. And until then, we will see you soon.
Bye all.